Hello. So yes, I'm going to be talking about a couple of things, mostly related to podcasting, although there is other application for the work I'm going to be talking about today. So next generation podcasting is the very big thing, but immersive and interactive media in general. So just very quickly, that's my name. I'm a final year PhD student at the University of York. I'm in the Music Computing and Psychology lab. This is basically 15 minutes to present to you 3 years of work. So if I sound like a mad scientist, it's because I'm a scientist and I'm mad because I have 6 months left to finish my PhD. So my research focus is in immersive and interactive podcasting using AI-driven tools. So the whole thing is focusing on creators and creative tools to make podcasts more immersive and interactive. So, quick premise. Before starting, I had to figure out what a podcast was. So if you're interested in an academic definition of what a podcast is, you can read this paper, which has done a lot of literature review to establish some boundaries of what can we extend to make new forms of podcasts. Because I'm also a software engineer a little bit, it was important for me to consider my end users throughout. So I wanted for podcast creators to be considered in the entire process of looking at what is next for podcasting. So that's to include end users, to increase engagement, user involvement, and to reduce my bias, but also bias in general when you're working with AI, new technologies. I don't think I have to teach you anything in that topic. So that's idea of participatory design really led my whole methodology, meaning that I've been basically in contact with podcast producers and audio producers throughout my PhD, asking them, how do you make podcasts right now? What do you need? What do you want in the future? And what do you expect? That means so many interviews and so many workshops. Very quickly, I'm going to show you a couple of screenshots of those, but this is basically months of just talks and chats with people who know what they're doing. This is a screenshot that came up after a first set of interviews, so we already had an idea of what people wanted podcasts to be. They wanted something to adapt to users' preferences and possible choices. So these are a couple of people voting on things that they enjoyed. All those topics came up on previous interviews. This is a particular participants' worksheet, thinking about modular podcasting, and I'm putting that out there as a foreshadowing because that's what we're talking about after that. So a few people actually were interested in this idea of modular podcasting, which is personalized version of the same podcast brought to the users in slightly different ways to cater to user preferences, habits, etc. This is one of the wireframes that came up. As you can see, I called it X because I was a visionary. And so this is a very brief wireframe of the idea of modular podcasting, enabling creators to easily piece together different chapters into different versions that would cater to particular preferences. If you want more of this, please talk to me. I have so many folders, so much data. The principal hook of what I'm talking about today is this idea of modular podcasting, which reacts to different preferences, but specifically respecting existing workflows and not adding any pressure on a process that's already quite complex, right? Broadcasting, I'm not teaching you anything. It's complicated to come from point A to B and have a full project at the end. So to not add any pressure on this already complex process, AI comes to mind because I'm an academic and I work in audio, and so AI is this shiny new thing that I have to see if it works. So in this particular case, I wanted to know if AI could help chapterize automatically audio so that we could ease the workflow, either for creative application, this idea of modular podcasting, or for assistive production, so that's to help you edit in bits, creating a very well documented in terms of metadata library of extracts if you're working with archives, etc. That could also have applications to live broadcasting, a lot of other things you can do when your content is adequately chapterized. Right, so there's a couple of things part of my project, but right now we're going to talk about pod-CLIPR, which is the algorithm that takes care of that segmentation. So what is pod-CLIPR? Shiny letters. Podcast chapterization through intelligent pattern recognition. It's using a sound recognition model, that's the AI bit, particularly a large-scale pre-trained audio neural network in a convolutional neural network architecture. A lot of words. If you're interested in reading more about the actual model, there's a reference right here that I encourage you to go see. It's trained on a very large data set of tagged events and audio events. This data set's available as well if you want to have a look. From these events, these tagged events that you get back from a sound recognition model, I apply a rule-based algorithm that basically looks at changes in frames within this audio. So it's based on 10 features that producers deemed relevant. I gave them a one-question questionnaire, which was the best use of my time throughout my PhD. And it was, out of these tags, what do you think is useful to describe podcasting audio? And also, side note, this is completely sound-based, so there's no large language model, no thematic analysis, nothing else going on but just looking at what's happening in the audio domain. So that makes it quite a lightweight solution if you're thinking about chapterization solutions generally. The 10 features that producers deemed relevant were these ones here: music, speech, conversation, female and male speech, narration, and then some environmental ones. I'll let you take that in if you're interested. And the idea is I'm mapping those onto the sound recognition output, and from the sound recognition output, I will not bother you with the math. I have cropped math documents because we're not here for this. Basically looking at this output as state vectors, and I want to establish the difference between those vectors to understand how much of a difference there is between one frame and the next. If there is a significant difference between those two, then a set of rules is applied. And these rules are going to determine whether these boundaries are real boundaries, real chapters, or they're just kind of glitches and things that didn't actually occur at a chapter marker. Right. If you have any more questions on the actual architecture of this, please do chat with me at the end. Once you've made an algorithm, it's pretty standard procedure to evaluate it and see how well it does. So I wanted to know how well does this perform? To know this, I needed a ground truth. Actually, not unsurprisingly, probably, there isn't a data set out there of chapterized audio anywhere. So I had to make that. And for this, I asked 10 expert BBC podcast producers to annotate a large corpus of podcast excerpts. So about 55-minute segments from the Apple Top 40. And each show was annotated twice because I don't want to just have one person's opinion. I want to form something of a consensus, right? So I want to make sure that people also agree on what chapters are. Because if people don't agree on what chapters are, then my tool can't agree with people who don't agree. You know what I mean? It's not possible to agree with something contentious. So I had to check first that chapters on their own are something that people can agree on. And finally, if you're interested in analysis method, I looked at window-based agreement, which means taking little chunks of audio and looking at whether or not two people are agreeing whether there's a chapter in that little window of time. From this was created the pod-49 dataset, which is a dataset of expertly annotated and chapterized podcast data. It will be available shortly once the write-up is through. I don't have time to get in the stats, but if you want to see pretty graphs and pretty pictures, please do come to me. I have a laptop, and I am a research student, and I always want to show people my graphs. Important takeaway, though, from all those stats, and you will have to trust me on that. Experts moderately agree on what chapters are. That means that it's actually pretty good. No, because statistically moderate agreement is good. So I know it's a bit, it seems moderate, but it's actually a good answer. That means that people see chapters as something real. They agree definitely on some of those, and then some people tend to over and under annotate, but that's kind of due to your background, where you're coming from, what you're trying to achieve with those chapters. When you give something as vague as the word as chapter, you're going to get different answers from it. So now the idea is, does pod-CLIPR also moderately agree with other experts? Okay, I've put in a bit of a spoiler at the top of this page. It does. Wow. I haven't done a PhD for nothing. So I wanted to test the algorithm on different parameters. I just talked about how it's rule-based. I'm not going to get into the details, but basically there's a few things I wanted to check the importance of within those rules. So first, the impact of jingle detection, which I've basically taken all my need for fun and excitement in software engineering and put it in the names of my functions. So jingle detection looks specifically at musical moments and puts those forward as contenders for potential chapters. So at the beginning, this was situated at the beginning of my rule set, and I wanted to know what happens when you remove it, when you change its position, etc. And actually, on the data set that I looked at, no jingle detection performed better, probably because most of those weren't particularly musical. But if you think of something like Desert Island Discs, for instance, if you know that, which is quite a musically segmented show, then you might want something that's toggleable, actually, to get those musical moments very easily recognizable. Then something like the maximum length of a transition. I found that actually the longer the transition, the more accurate the outputs. And then the different threshold between two vector states, I'm not going to get into that, but basically, if it detects more different boundaries at the first stage, it's going to filter out more chapters. So you'll get more accurate results at the end, if that makes sense. And finally, I looked at the threshold for sound recognition. That's the first step from the model, what I'm getting, those features. And actually, kind of surprisingly, lower is mildly more accurate, but it doesn't actually matter how much low you get. At some point, you just kind of plateau out on the accuracy that you're going to get. So pod-CLIPR performs on par with human experts. Hooray! And the chapter that it suggests are credible. There's a threshold for sound recognition, but it doesn't impact inter-annotator agreement, notably beyond a certain point. Right, and I just talked about how it was good to be able to adjust and toggle some functions. We're going to talk about that actually I have some time, so it's fine. We're going to talk about that in the second bit, which is all about the application of this particular algorithm. Because I'm trying not only to develop something back-endy that is only for researchers and people who like to look at code and GitHub repositories, I also want to do something that actual creators can use and can make something out of during my PhD. So that's podular, which is the smashing of the word podcast in modular. Thank you. That was the appropriate response, by the way. So that's some of the applications. It's an online tool. It's still in beta. It has a couple of rounds of iterative development still to go. So you're seeing something that's not even new. It's unfinished, but working. So that's the important thing. It's developed iteratively using participatory design. And I have a very short demo. Yay. Thank you. Again, right response. So that's the first episode of the podcast Siege, which is the BBC Radio 4 fiction from Limelight. And I'm going to stand kind of awkwardly on the side so I can talk over some bits. Right, so this is podular. You can input some file links. You can have several files. If you do, they will be linearized. You have your email address because you can access your projects personally. Put the name of your projects and decide whether or not you want your files to be chapterized. If you do, you're going to get an email, about 1.5 minutes for an 8-minute file in this case. And podular is basically in two halves. The first half is an audio editor, pretty standalone. You can seek using a playhead. You have a zoom in and out function, a volume function, etc. The important thing is it comes preloaded with those pod-CLIPR suggestions for chapters. And I think we'll listen to a couple of examples.
I checked my group chats, and everybody was saying they're late. This one is late here. This one is in traffic here. This one is doing this. How can I start without them? I could not start on my own. That's why I was there. I was inside to wait.
I'm a games designer. I make first-person shoot-em-ups, ones with loads of blood and loads of bullets.
So I chose this specifically because there are very easy chapter markers to listen to.
You're really sneaky. Listen. Okay, I'm just here to tell the truth.
I was not supposed to be at the supermarket.
So in both cases, it's cut off by the sound effect, but actually...
So you can't hear nothing when you have them in. I just started singing along.
Actually, it does work on just speech. It doesn't need a sound effect to be triggered. It's looking at really small changes within the sound waves. So
you can't hear nothing when you have them in. I just started singing along to Meg Thee Stallion. Do you know her?
In this particular case, you'll have to trust me in terms of chapters that there is actually a distinction here. And you can drag and drop those when they're not landing exactly when you want to. So for instance, here, you could kind of see that it just landed in the middle of a waveform. Chapter marker shouldn't be there. you can shuffle it, you can add and remove segment as needs be. Once you're happy with those, you can click this neat chapterize button, which would basically make a bank of chapters that you can listen to because they're all tiny players.
Is Mom gonna be able to hear this?
I'm a games designer. I make first-person shoot 'em.
I just started singing along to Meg Thee Stallion. Do you know her?
Right, so because it's an online tool, it's all working with media blobs and going around the non-trivial task of lossless stuff in web audio. So this is all working in WAV format. You can drag and drop those chapters and arrange them in different versions. The idea is that then you render them and you can download them easily to create different versions. So that's the more creative application of chapterization. But obviously there's so many ways that you can see being used just for creating a very well documented library of content if you're interested in anything personalized or adaptive. That's, I think, a key component of a lot of work that next generation audio and podcasting is doing in general. So some next step on this particular demo I showed, some UI improvements are much needed, metadata panel, which would help with that whole next generation audio that I just talked about. Other import formats, currently it's a web app, but could it be a plugin? It would make it more practical, wouldn't it? Last round of user testing, final workshops, etc. Lots of researchy bits that I have to wrap up. And lastly, just some final words on my project. What do podcast producers want? They want to produce personalized content for the listener. And when do they want it? They wanted it yesterday. And how do we make it happen? We actually give them tools that make their work easier and not harder, because we don't want to make something that's already so hard even harder. So if we're using AI, we want to preserve creative agency, and we want it to be used for a purpose and not just used because it's fancy and shiny and new. So no perfect chapterization. Sorry, no perfect chapterization. The data set is almost available. The algorithm works. It's relatively lightweight. If you're interested in AI chapterization, Podular is coming soon. So is the write-up and the thesis. And if you want any more news, you can scan that QR code. That's it. Sorry about that.